You hear that the economy is doing well.
Yes.
Is it?
Well, I mean, for all intents and purposes, yes. By all metrics associated with assessing an economy, whether it be broad numbers, whether it be looking at sectoral growth, whether it be looking at industry growth or subsector growth, the economy is doing fantastic. Additionally, when one looks at the framework within which you operate, that is to say, the real sector in the economy operates, it's a very stable framework. That is to say, though we have had rising inflation in the country, it's still relatively low when juxtaposed alongside the Anglophonic Caribbean, Latin America, and broader global or hemispheric inflation. When you look at the exchange rate, it is still stable amongst many other indicators. And so at its core, yes, the economy is doing great.
My understanding of inflation at a very basic level is that it's the increase in the price of goods.
Yes.
But we've been hearing a lot of talks about promises to lower the cost of living. How do you reconcile those two? One, you're dealing with inflation, but then there are promises to lower the cost of living.
So it's important to understand the various categories of inflation drivers, and that will give an understanding to the average onlooker or spectator to the election as to whether a promise to lower inflation beyond a certain measure is really something that is possible.
Okay.
So there are different measures, and I'll just go through them. There are different types of inflation, and I'll just go through them very briefly. One, there's something called demand pull inflation. That is to say, when there are increases in demand within the economy, more people are actually competing for goods by way of purchasing, which essentially makes goods relatively scarcer, and therefore the price must go up because as scarcity of a particular commodity increases, prices go up. So that's one component. Secondly, there's something called, in economic terms, it's called wage push inflation or salary push inflation within a modern context. That is to say, when there is too much injection into the economy by way of wages or salaries increases that are especially publicly announced and it goes up rapidly, that tends to push inflation along. And the reason why is that more shopkeepers, more persons involved in commerce, etc., in anticipation of that increased salary, increased purchasing power within the economy, will tend to raise their prices commensurately or concomitantly. So there is always a positive correlation between salary increases and a level of inflation. The third big bucket of inflation is that of what is called imported inflation. And this is especially relevant for countries like Guyana, that a vast number of our items in the consumer basket are not, but they are imported. And thus, Guyana, as a small open economy, integrated into the international architecture of the economic structure or into the global economy, cannot dictate price, as we are not a price dictator. We don't have massive manufacturing of major commodities happening in Guyana, save and except a few items or a few commodities. And therefore, a lot of what we are seeing in Guyana has to do with global economic occurrences, transportation to Guyana, wars, and what are termed exogenous factors to Guyana. So insofar as promises, quote unquote, can be made to lower inflation, one has to be cognizant of where inflation is emanating from, why it is happening in Guyana, and then examine whether or not it is possible to control some elements of this inflation. Now, I just want to say one more thing on that. when one speaks about controlling inflation, a very populist measure which appeals by and large to the masses is price control.
Yeah, like a cap.
Like a cap, a price control, or whether it's on rent, whether it's on market prices, etc. But we've seen time and over, by way of examples, tried and tested policies, that when you attempt to implement controls on prices in a market, that you end up creating what is called a gray market. That is to say, you create an artificial market outside of the official market where people end up paying more for items than would have otherwise happened. And so what ends up occurring is an unintended consequence of actually spiraling inflation even further. Buttressing that point too is the fact that policing rent control, price control, and policing rent prices, for example, it's an extremely difficult thing to practically do. What will you do? Go around board the market and tell each person, hey, don't sell for that? Or you'll go to every tenant in the economy and say, what are you paying? What's your landlord charging you? It's extremely impractical. And so it is always a better use of policy tools and measures to be able to say, let's create the environment and let's facilitate an environment where more competition can happen, prices can be lowered, and manage the level of inflation.
So, if we aren't putting certain ceilings or caps in place, if you're telling don't go beyond $100 for this particular good, what are some ways that the government, whichever government is in place after the September 1 elections, can help to really manage cost of living?
Yeah, so it's extremely important, that point. And cost of living is something that really reaches down to every single person in the country. And insofar as a global situation exists, there are certain measures that the government can take. Our government, to their credit, has actually taken a number of those measures so far, and it is no coincidence that that is the reason you see the prices, the general price level in the economy and the general rate of inflation being lower on average when compared to. So it is important, firstly, to couch, as I would have mentioned, the global economic situation and the fact that we are a small open economy integrated into this global village, this global economic village. So with that in mind, we have to firstly ensure that one of the major inputs into production, which of course we know is petrol, gasoline, that the excise tax is adjusted on that. Yeah. Many know that I play a role in private sector advocacy. That was something that we were speaking about for some time, the reduction of that excise tax down from double digits, and now it's at zero. That is one measure that needs to be maintained. So that's in the first instance. Secondly, there needs to be support, continued support for freight charges being where they were, which is what we already have. Freight charges being at pre-pandemic levels. That's extremely important because transport and the global transport network supply chains have actually become a little bit more complex over time and a bit more nuanced because of global occurrences between the United States and China. I mean, we've seen now the price for shipping 20 and 40 feet containers from China. They've gone up drastically. And so we need to continue as an organized private sector, firstly, responsible stewards of the economy, public intellectuals, and continue to work with whichever government is there to ensure that they understand the need for continuity in those policies. So from an international standpoint, that is extremely important. In terms of the international aspect too, diversification of the sources of products is also extremely important. So, as well as transport networks, so that we are really hedging against risk that exists. So, take for example, if 90% of our commerce is emanating from one region and has to pass through one area, maybe say the Suez Canal, and there's another blockage that occurs, or there is for some reason another exogenous shock, that the point is that there needs to be continued diversification of the sources of international commodities. And that is something really that is up to the commercial participants in the economy, the merchandisers who import and distribute. So that is something that needs to be continued, and it needs to be encouraged strongly. So I'll say that from an international front. Secondly, domestic, we need to ensure that, especially in light of food prices and what is happening with food price inflation, we need to ensure that sufficient incentives are provided for small and medium-sized enterprises to increase their domestic production. That is extremely important, and I want to say that this ought to be examined also for particularly the agriculture sector.
But incentives like what?
So what one can begin to look at is strategic tax breaks for encouraging certain types of subsectors. So, for example, what is happening for cash crops? What is happening for poultry farmers? What is happening for agro processors? There are also, importantly, a few items in the previous administration which, when the moves were being made from exempt to zero rated and zero rated to exempt, some food commodities were left in the exempt basket and they were not adjusted back to zero rated. Now, only recently in conversation with some agro processors, what they're explaining is that they are seeing increases for those same products that are in the exempt basket. They are seeing increases in the inputs into their productive process. That is to say, the price of bottles, the PET bottles that you would blow up. That is to say, labeling, etc. And so, because of that, the prices for some of those commodities may start to go up in the near future. So, it's important for those individuals within agro-processing, which can help to supply and cushion some of that domestic impact of food price inflation, to really be given some amount of cushion in that regard. So it's examining strategic tax breaks, examining perhaps if offset credits can be given by way of the Guyana Revenue Authority, ensuring that the food basket is updated, examined thoroughly and updated as to whether all of the necessary items that are used are being zero rated as opposed to being exempted, and also looking perhaps at some level of relief for individuals who are in the other crops sector, the cash crop sector, particularly where inclement weather patterns are coming on. I believe that we may be soon in a drought scenario again, one of the weather phenomenons, where it's extremely dry, a very dry season. So some anticipatory measures ought to be examined for those individuals like I would have just mentioned.
And what about cash grants, cash transfers? We have heard lots of promises in relation to those cash grants. Do they really help?
Yeah, so that is always an interesting point. And the literature is in development economics is not resoundingly clear as yet as to the true long-term impact of cash grants. What I can say, however, is that once cash grants are being targeted to vulnerable groups, children who are investing in themselves and by extension investing in the country's future, groups that are not traditionally earning as much as the other individuals in the economy. Once it's being targeted to vulnerable people, the literature has demonstrated that there is a strong impetus to support economic growth. Broad cash grants from time to time, once unannounced or not anticipatory, does not create a degree of expectation within the economy. And therefore, from time to time, unannounced or one-off or ad hoc cash grants can help to drive or spur economic growth along from a demand side. So it helps from time to time with increasing aggregate demand, as we would say in economics, and really helping to push an economy along from an aggregate demand standpoint. So yes, cash grants are useful.
Yeah.
Cash grants have their merit. They, especially when reaching into sub-segments of the society, they are extremely useful, but they also have to be managed in the amount, the way that it is transmitted to the public, the anticipatory effect that it can create if it becomes expected at particular times. Recall when I would have mentioned earlier, I said when certain types of announcements would be made on wage increases, it creates an anticipatory effect by persons who are in the private sector, commerce, merchandisers, shopkeepers, etc. And that in itself would help to pull inflation along, or push inflation along rather. Cash grants almost create that same sort of effect if they are consistently announced. So take, for example, if one says, every month there will be $400,000 being provided as a transfer to households, then once the date is set, what you can end up doing is create an artificial bubble every time the cash grant has to happen, and it can cause inflation to spiral out of control. So cash grants are useful. They have their merit. They obviously have to be managed in the way that they are transmitted as a policy measure. But the long-term impact on the economy, if not managed well, does also have its drawbacks.
Sure. On the other side of things, what I want to talk about before we wrap up is what can a government do to help stimulate activity in the economy outside of catering for cost of living, which is extremely important. But what do you do to stimulate that activity?
Yeah, so it's important to remember always, going back to an elementary understanding of a macroeconomy, there are those that demand and there are those that supply. Aggregate demand refers to consumers, and it refers to everyone in the economy who has purchasing power to be able to purchase. And looking at strategic salary increases, looking at cash grants, looking at lowering personal income tax, looking at putting more money into the hands of consumers, generally is on the front of managing aggregate demand. On the front of aggregate supply are essentially all of those issues that you hear the private sector associations talking about time and over, because the lowering of the cost of electricity helps an individual to supply products into the economy at a more competitive rate. An individual who is perhaps farming in an area and has a very bad road then has to increase his transportation cost. And so investments like farm to market access roads, you would hear that being discussed. Other key pieces of infrastructure bridge not only spatial divides, but they also aid very strongly in lowering cost of goods. Take, for example, if one had to provide a product to someone living in Eccles and you were living in Monrepo, you would have to factor in your time to transit through traffic from the East Coast to the East Bank. An investment in, for example, the Ogle to Eccles Highway helps to reduce the time that it takes to provide that product or service in that area. And so investments in key pieces of infrastructure can help to commensurately lower the cost of goods and effectively create a more competitive environment. So there are big buckets from the aggregate supply side that can happen. It is also very important that when we speak about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, within that context, it's what we term the real sector of the economy, the output side of the economy. But there is also the monetary side of the economy, which is managed through the Bank of Guyana. So there's fiscal policy that applies by way of the government's budget, aggregate demand interplaying with aggregate supply, as I would have just mentioned. And then there's the monetary side of the economy, which is managed by way of the Bank of Guyana's monetary policy, which has to do with the injection of foreign exchange into the economy when one is looking at the foreign trade sector, which has to do with the injection of domestic currency into the economy to be able to ensure that there's not scarcity of notes, there's not scarcity of funds, Guyanese dollars at any particular institution or in any particular pocket of the economy to ensure that there's continued commerce that can happen. So in that regard, it's important for us to continue to pay attention to all quadrants of the economy that exists. And it's important for us to look at the issues that we may have, or what I like to term as the growing pains that will emerge, and monitor extremely carefully. This is why, as a people, as a citizenry, we ought to ensure that who we elect come September 1st is a government that understands the policy landscape, is a government that has a proven track record of delivering, a government that then also listens to the cries of both the consumers as well as the private sector. Because, as I would have mentioned, the consumers represent the aggregate demand side, the private sector represents the aggregate supply side. And it's through listening to the cries and the concerns that one is able to help to craft policies that can really mitigate the growing pains associated with growth. One final corollary to that is one has to always remember that economic management occurs within an environment of scarcity. If we exist and live in a perfect world, everyone would have everything that they want. Mm-hmm. But because we do not exist in a perfect world, and we exist in a world where the principle of scarcity applies, it means that we as individuals, we as corporations, we as countries, governments, etc., are all faced with choices. Those choices have to do with the allocation of resources. Because if I had infinite resources, I can do everything and anything that I want. But because I have scarce resources, I have to then allocate my resources. So it is important for us to examine political parties' allocation of resources and look at it within realistic frameworks of what can actually happen. And so those are elements that I believe the Guyanese voting populace as well as the Guyanese citizenry at large, pay attention to very keenly, not only in this election period, but also more broadly, because then you would understand if a political party or a politician or some government is making a public pronouncement on what they want to do, then you can realistically assess whether this is something that actually can be done. Mm-hmm. So I'd offer that as being my thoughts on what one ought to look for.
For the ordinary person, not as versed in economics mm-hmm. as you are, what are some simple things to look for to just decipher mm-hmm. who is, I guess, in rudimentary terms, sensible mm-hmm. about economic management?
Mm-hmm. I think as an onlooker, you have to be grounded in reality. If someone is approaching the populace with something that seems very outlandish from the status quo or from the norm, it's important to look at it and assess. If this is something that can be done, then why isn't it done? So, what are some of the key things to look for? I would say, look back at some of the budgets that have been done. And you know, there's a document the Ministry of Finance produces, for example, called Budget at a Glance. Look at the levels of investments that have occurred and try to assess or just try to look at it and understand whether a promise that is being made broadly aligns with the resources that we may seem to have. A trend will emerge once you begin to look at it, because, like I would have mentioned, anything can be promised, but what can be realistically attained with the resources that we have is important. Additionally, execution is very important. Looking at major political parties in Guyana, because it's only really the two major political parties have been in government, examine the track record of execution, because promising is one thing, but then executing on a promise is another thing, which is essentially public policy management, ensuring that you are able to execute what you are talking about. So a very interesting exercise too for a voting populace would be to go back to 2015 manifesto and try to see what was promised there and what was achieved in the 5 years. We'll only deal with the past 10 years, and it's especially relevant because we've had two different political parties. Then go back to 2020 and then examine what has been done over the past 5 years. And that will also give an understanding of track record and execution. And individuals can look at those and then make their decisions from there. New entrants to the political landscape, one always has to assess very carefully because new entrants tend to not have a track record to go on. Save and except if it's a personal track record, then you can examine. But I'll tell you this, having been involved in the administration of government, that is to say, I myself was in Ministry of Finance and so forth, other ministries in years bygone, being in government and executing in government and having that understanding is an extremely important asset to have. And you may hear some seasoned politicians talking that up in Guyana. And that is not something that is by happenstance. It's extremely important because it gives you a certain speed and efficiency to make decisions because you are fully cognizant of the system that exists. The learning curve in government is a very steep one, and so it is always important to observe where seasoned politicians and major political players who have been in government, where they are in the political spectrum. So I'll offer that.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you, Richard, for joining us today.
Absolutely.
And back to our elections coverage.